Well, today's Palm Sunday. I'm not going to, every Easter, every season, we try to switch things up a little bit. Sometimes you go to church or you go to gatherings of some kind, and it's pretty predictable, okay? It's like, okay, I already know what they're going to talk about. I know what they're going to say. And so I want to be careful in our service with that, not to do the same thing all the time. Last year we did, I did a little bit of series on Lent. We talked about what Lent meant, what Lent means. And this morning I'm not going to really focus on Palm Sunday. I want to focus a little bit more on the grace of God. And then next Sunday, of course, we'll be talking about Resurrection Sunday as well. But today's message is going to sort of lead us into what Easter is really all about. If you could summarize Easter in just a couple of words, I'd want to summarize it with the grace of God. And so this morning we're going to look at an invitation to come, God's grace. And, I could begin this morning. We have all these things that sort of grab our attention. We've got lots of things. You've got things going through your mind right now that are sort of grabbing your attention. And if I begin this morning and I start talking about or use a story of someone that I know that's not very well off, someone that we might classify as being poor, that may not get your attention very well. But if I begin this morning talking about somebody who's very well off, somebody who's very wealthy, that may get your attention. They may grab you a little more. I'm not sure. You can decide for yourself. But in preparing this message this week, I was thinking about something from my own life that sort of grabbed my attention when I think about invitation, okay? And we're focusing on God's invitation to come through His grace. And so I'm like, what kind of invitations have I gotten over the years that have really just grabbed me? And so, we all get numerous invitations. You've gotten invitations throughout your life to parties and events and gatherings of certain things, certain people, and I have as well. And when I was thinking about this week, I was, both serving the church and the business world in my life. I have had the privilege of meeting and making friends with lots of people, lots of different kinds of people, not just religious types, not just vocational ministry people or missionaries, but businessmen, business owners, all kinds of folks like that. One particular person, his name is Randy. He's a few years older than me, and Randy lives on a 10,000-acre ranch in Montana. Now, can you guys imagine 10,000 acres? I mean, I can't even get that in my mind. 10,000 acres in Montana, up near just a small town near Missoula, Montana. And I was thinking about, that relationship with him. This guy has a net worth of about $145 million. Now, I can't even get my mind around that. 10,000 acres, all that, I can't get my head around that. And so, he and I have ridden motorcycles together several times, and the last time I was with him, we had gotten back from a weekend trip, where we stayed in a house that his wife designed and built up there near Glacier National Park. And, this house just blew my mind away. This thing's got a heated driveway, okay? The concrete is heated, so it melts the snow. I'm like, wow, that's way out of my league. And so we had ridden motorcycles up there with some friends, and we had a nice weekend up there. And then we met him and his brother in another small town about halfway between there and Missoula. And we sort of had some fellowship that afternoon, and we got ready to leave. He walked over and he shook my hand, and he said, "Hey, Ron, I just want to give you an invitation to come back and see me sometime." And so I was just kind of blown away, and, I sort of keep my distance from him a little bit because I don't want him to think that I want something from him. He's a rich man, and I don't want him to think, hey, I'm making friends with you so I can get something. And so I sort of keep my distance a little bit. And then he gives me this handshake and this invitation to come back and see him sometime. Now, when I thought about that, I wasn't so much impressed with his wealth or the land or anything like that. But what I was impressed with was the friendship that he offered me when he didn't have to. I have nothing to offer this guy, okay? Nothing. I bring nothing to the table compared to what he has. And yet he extends to me a hand of friendship and an invitation to come back and visit him sometime and stay in this this house, this 5-bedroom house, whatever it is. Now, you and I are going to get invitations our whole lives, guys. And I don't know about you, but whenever someone invites me to something, I always feel like it's an honor and a privilege. And I'm somewhat, humbled by the fact that someone would want me to be a part of a very important day or event in their life. And when we get invitations, now you think about this, we sometimes brag about them, don't we? I mean, it's like, hey, guess what I got invited to? Guess who invited me over? Or something like that. Sometimes we name drop, and if you're not sure what name dropping means, it's, I'm dropping a name down to this very important person so that you know that I know that they know me. Okay, so I'm name dropping, letting you know that I know this person. Hey, I got their cell phone number. So-and-so shared their email address with me, and they're really important, really famous people, and so you're sort of name dropping. And then, I think more, when I mentioned Randy a moment ago, I thought more about not the fact that he was wealthy, but the fact that this guy was inviting me into a space in his life, into a place where he didn't have to invite me, and to share part of what he had with me. Now, and that just blew me away. Now, whether someone's rich or poor, I would feel the same way about it. That someone has invited me into their space. Somebody's invited me into a part of their life. Somebody has invited me to be, to share something that they have with them. Now, this morning, we look at this whole thing about invitation, about God and His invitation. Well, guys, as we approach Easter, Resurrection Sunday, I like to call it, Christians sort of prepare themselves to celebrate the most important event in human history. Now, let's get this together, okay? Because, this isn't just a religious holiday. It's actually a historical event in real life. You see, Easter can mean various different things, but Easter is really God's invitation to come. And I want us to think about it that way together this morning, okay? That when we think about Easter, Resurrection Sunday, Jesus dying, being buried, and rising from the dead, it's God's invitation for us to come. The God of creation, a holy God, a perfect God, is inviting us into His space. He's inviting us to share with Him what He is, and He's giving us all an invitation to come and be a part of that. Well, resurrection really is a story of God's grace. And it's a story of God's love that is so deep for every human being that He invites us into that story, to be a part of it. Now, guys, listen, long before Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead, He said this. He said, if anybody will come to me, I will never deny him. I'll never, delete him. If somebody comes to me, Jesus said, I'll never unfriend them. That's what He was saying in our own language today. And so he's inviting us to come. Okay, now let's take a look at John chapter 6 for a moment. And I want us to begin this morning with this up close and personal. Because I think that's really how God sees us. He wants to invite us into His spaces. And God's saying, I want a relationship with you that's really up front and personal. That God who's created everything, this awesome, perfect God, holy God, is inviting us all into His space. God is inviting us into His places. And He's inviting us to share all that He is and all that He has. And so in John chapter 6, verse 37, Jesus says, however, those that the Father has given me will come to me, and I will, look at this, He says, I will never reject them. Now, guys, listen, for all of us this morning, including myself, I want you to think about who you are today, your background, your personality, everything that's going on in your life right now. And we sort of get this idea that a holy God is inviting me into a space, and then we get these things in our minds, like these barriers that why we couldn't come to God, why we wouldn't be worthy of that. And Jesus is saying, listen, it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what you believe, what your background is, the mistakes and all the things in your life, I will never reject you. It's a promise that He gives us. And so he's inviting us into his space. He's inviting us into what he's provided for us. And he says, I will never, no matter what, ever reject you. Wow, that is powerful stuff. Now, there's a lot of things that's happened over the years that I haven't been invited to. And whenever you don't get invited, you sort of feel a little rejected. You know, it's like, hey, I didn't get invited to that. And Jesus is saying, listen, everyone's invited. No matter who you are, you'll never be rejected. You know, one of the reasons why we love hearing other people's stories, we love hearing stories about other people. I know I do. I love reading stories about people. I love hearing their story. And so we like that. And one of the reasons why we all like other people's stories is because those are stories that we just connect with. I mean, have you ever heard of someone's story and you're listening real close and you're trying to grab something that you relate to? You're trying to grab something that you connect with. Yeah. And it's like Easter is Jesus. The resurrection is his story to us. And it's his way of connecting. He wants to connect with us. And it's upfront and personal. Now listen. I think more than any other time in our cultures and with social media outlets we have today, they've sort of trained us all to have these shallow relationships. Do you ever think about it that way? The shallow relationships around you? You know, we have all kinds of friends, all kinds of acquaintances. We know people. We're connected with people. You get on Facebook and someone has 237,000 likes. You ever see that? Or they've got 587 friends. I've got a friend in the ministry. He's on LinkedIn, and there's like 800 connections. I mean, who knows 800 people? Okay, and so it's like, you know, we want all these connections, but so often we have these connections, but they're really not that personal. And through our cultures everywhere, all over the world, and through social media, we have to be cautious because sometimes what happens is it sort of teaches us to have these shallow relationships. You know the kind I'm talking about. The kind of relationship that, you know, people tell you what they think you want to hear instead of the truth, that kind of relationship. Or, you know, they make surface commitments to you, and then they easily back out of them, you know, making all the exit doors to get out if I don't really want to, you know, be a part of it. Or we have these relationships that invest just enough of ourselves that we have a relationship, but not really true oneness with another person. And so if nothing else this morning, maybe we could be challenged to take our relationships to a different, deeper level with people. And when we think about a relationship with God or with Christ, he wants to be upfront and personal. I mean, he wants to get into the depths of who we are. He wants to get into the deepness of our lives and have this awesome, wonderful spiritual relationship with us. And so we read in John 6:37 that Jesus says, no matter who comes to me, I'll never reject them. I want to be personal with them, up close, one, spiritually. Now, I want you to go, if you will, if you have a Bible this morning, you know, a lot of people, or most people don't really, they don't really bring Bibles to church that much anymore, but you've got it on your phone, you've got it somewhere on your electronic device, or we got it on the screen here this morning. We're going to go to John chapter 8, okay? I'm going to pull something out of John chapter 8 this morning that's going to help us understand this thing about grace just a little bit better. And while you're turning there, let me set the stage for us all just real quickly. You see, John chapters 7 through 9, all three of these chapters take place in a place called Jerusalem. The same Jerusalem that's there today, okay? The same Israel, the same Jerusalem, same place in the Bible. And all this takes place during what was known as the Feast of Tabernacles. Now get this, guys. Some of you like these a little bit deeper things. You like the historical things, and so we try to give a little bit to everybody every Sunday. But what takes place in these three chapters takes place in Jerusalem, and it also is during a time that's called the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, how many of you travel back to, You go back to Seoul, Korea, you go back somewhere in Korea occasionally, you go back for Chinese New Year, you go back to Detroit, you go somewhere back home once in a while. How many of you in here? You travel back somewhere. Okay, let me try that again. Yeah, come on, guys. Let's wake up. You travel back somewhere in your life occasionally, okay? And I do too, all right? And so the people, when we look at John chapter 7 through 9, this was the Feast of Tabernacles was one of the 3 great pilgrimage feasts. Now, let me go slow. And what happened during these feasts is that the really devoted Jewish people came back to Jerusalem to celebrate these feasts, okay? Kind of like you and I go back home for vacation, or we go back to a place during spring break. We're going back to reorient ourselves, or to visit people, or to do something special that we can't do anywhere else. That's what they were doing. And so all these people were coming to Jerusalem. They were traveling back to reorient themselves and to remind themselves of the Exodus story. Now let me give you the 1-minute version of the Exodus story, in case you don't know. The Egyptian people had enslaved the Jewish people for 400 years. And during 400 years, they had prayed and asked God to deliver them from being slaves to the Egyptians. God answers that prayer. He raises up a leader called Moses, and he leads them out into this place called a promised land. In other words, in our language today, we would say that they left Egypt and went to Israel, okay? Most of you know that story on some level. Now, when God led them out of Egypt, he promised them this modern-day place that they would live forever. Now, here's the point. The point is this, guys, is that every one of us have something that we identify with. Now, I want you to think about your own life this morning, okay? Just think about yourself for a second. Here's some of the things we identify with. Our food. Our clothes. The clothes we wear, they sort of ID us a little bit. This guy dresses like that, and she dresses like this, and they always wear that. It sort of identifies us. How many of you think, the car you drive identifies you a little bit? We look at certain cars, and it's like they're rich, they're poor. We do that, don't we? We identify people that way. We classify them like that. Or you go to their house, and you look at the neighborhood, and you look at their house, and you look at the furnishings, and you look at all the things in there, and you're kind of IDing that person. This is what identifies them. Or the people they hang out with is identifying them. Every one of us have these things that we identify ourselves with, we connect with, and then those things also identify us. Okay? Now, when we go back to the point of what's taking place here, this event, going back to Jerusalem and celebrating these feasts, was a way to identify Israel. In other words, in the Old Testament, God instructed the people to celebrate these feasts, and it would help them reconnect to their story. And that's why they celebrated them every year. We reconnect, okay? Sometimes when we're not involved in something, we tend to forget about it. And so they're going back every year, and they're having these feasts, and they're reorienting themselves with the story and reorienting themselves with who they are. You see, the things sometimes in our own lives, they not only identify us, but they keep us connected with who we really are. And so when you look at the feasts in the Old Testament, they were a way to reconnect the people. And so I guess in other words, we could say this, that there were Old Testament foodies, okay? That they really were Old Testament foodies. Okay, foodies not a new thing, okay? They had them all the way back in the Old Testament. They celebrated with feasts. Now, I don't think it's any secret that we like to eat. All of us like to eat. We do. Some of you are waiting for lunch right now. You're thinking about lunch. You're smelling lunch. You're thinking about what's going to be for lunch. Foodies. And so all the way back in the Old Testament, we have foodies. Let's look at Leviticus for a moment, chapter 23. Here's God's word to his people. He's saying, these are my appointed feasts, more than one. The appointed feasts of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies. And so we see that God is bringing his people back to reorient themselves, back to identify themselves, and back so that they don't forget who they are and where they came from through food, feasts. Now, I don't know about you, but I think most people will find any reason to eat, won't we? If we don't have a reason to eat, we'll invent a reason to eat. Everything today almost is around feasts as well. Almost every gathering of some kind has food in it. You know, there's just something about food that brings people together, isn't there? You know, you sit down at the meal, at the table, and you're eating a meal together, and there's just something about that that just sort of builds community and offers invitation for people to come and join you. You can hardly hear a conversation today without people talking about food on some level. And we eat for fun, we eat for celebration, we eat for experience. It's almost like we've forgotten that we eat for nutrition, okay? Yeah. Well, our oldest son is what you might call a foodie. And he talks about, guys, before you eat this, you need to clean your palate. You got to clean your palate so you can get all the flavors. And I remember him telling me about a meal he ate one time, and he's like, Dad, he goes, you eat this food and it just explodes in your mouth. The flavors just explode. And I'm like, that's good. I said, usually I eat just to fill my stomach up, okay? And so he's talking about all this experience of food. And so we all, have these food experiences. Some of you have probably memorized most of the menus in Cincinnati, okay? And so we go back to the Old Testament, and each of these feasts were different. There was a feast for marriage, a feast for love, a feast for weeks, a feast for trumpets, all kinds of feasts, and each one of them had a meaning. And this particular feast focused on the result of their rebellion. Now here's how the story goes. They've left Egypt. God's answered their prayers. He's taking them to the promised land. And what should have taken 11 days to get to the promised land took 40 years. No GPS. They got lost in more ways than one. Because they rebelled, they complained, they griped, they grumbled, they lost sight of what was going on. All those things, that's a whole other message. But these feasts, this particular feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, focused on the result of their rebellion while they were traveling to the Promised Land. And the point of this feast, get this guys, the point of this feast wasn't just to remember how they wandered in the desert. Deeper than that, this feast was more about getting in touch with their own rebellion and their need for God's forgiveness. You see, God was reminding them every year when they came back to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles that this feast was to remind me of who I really am in a deeper way. It was to remind me that there are times in my life that I've rebelled against God. There are times in my life when I just haven't been focused on God. There's times in my life when I need to reorient myself to the fact that I haven't always lived the way God wants me to live. And so I need to remind myself that God has offered me this invitation of forgiveness and direction. It sort of reminds us a little bit of the season of Lent. Now, in case you don't know, Lent is a time where it's some religions practice Lent more than others. It's a time of reflection. It's a time of penance or, forgiveness. It's a time of asking God to forgive us and, just give us a new start, a new cleansing. It's a time of introspection on our own lives. But this was a time for people to celebrate the thanksgiving of God's grace. Now, we celebrate Easter for many different reasons. We sing Hosanna. We sing songs of resurrection. We sing Up from the Grave He Rose. We sing all those things. We do all these things. We have communion, all this stuff during Easter. But one thing I think that we sometimes forget is that Easter is really, deep down in the heart and soul of it, is about God's grace because of our own rebellion. And it's God saying, hey, listen, I've allowed my son to die, to be buried, to rise again, because that's my invitation for you to experience my grace, my love, and this desire I have to have this deep, wonderful relationship with you. Now hang on to that for a second. You see, we're looking at John chapter, these 3 chapters in John. And we've just looked at a historical view of the Feast of Tabernacles and how that reminds us that, hey, you know what? I need God. On this level of my life, I need God. And so in these 3 chapters, John pulls out this story of this promiscuous woman. And now guys, let's be real today. Here's really what this is saying to us. He's talking about this scene, this story of this woman's life, where this gal has been having sex with almost everybody in town. And she gets caught. And so the religious leaders, they bring her in front of Jesus. Now let's look at this, okay? In John chapter 8, verses 3 through 5, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. Now look at this. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery." And then they go on to say this. In the law, Moses commanded for us to stone a woman like this. And then look at this question. Now what do you say? Here's what the law says. Here's what she's done. What do you say? What they were saying, guys, is this. We have every right in the world for every one of us to pick up a stone and throw it at this woman and stone her to death because she was caught in this rebellion against God. She was caught in this sin against God. And Jesus, we have the right to do this. We have the privilege of doing this. And then they look at him like, what do you say? What do you think we should do? And I think it's interesting that John points this out. Here's why. Is because this story takes place at the very end of the festival, the Feast of Tabernacles. Now think about that. Remember, the Feast of Tabernacles is to draw our attention to our own rebellion, our own mistakes. And here you've got these religious guys finding this woman caught in adultery and bringing her in front of everybody so that they can point out her rebellion. Wow. And then they look at Jesus and they're like, what do you think we should do? Putting him on the spot. Let me draw your attention to something. We're talking about grace this morning. And I think this is a story about grace. John, the 6, 7, and 8. Go back and read this for yourself. Obviously, we don't have time to deal with every detail of the story or what's going on here. But grace means gift. It means gift. And literally, translated from the Bible, it means a gift that you're not worthy of. A gift that you don't deserve or I don't deserve. And so when we talk about the grace of God, it's God's way of inviting us into something that we really don't deserve. It's God's way of, it's a place that we, God's grace is this place where we think, I don't really deserve to be there. I'm not worthy to be in this place with God. And yet at the same time, it's kind of like this woman that they bring out. She was not worthy of forgiveness. She wasn't worthy of anything but to be stoned. And John points this out so that, listen guys, he points this out so that not that we can see her, that we can see ourselves. And every time I read this, I'm like, okay, here's a woman caught in adultery, but what about me, God? What have I done? What about my junk? What about my stuff? And so, it's the story. Jesus points this out for the story of grace, of inviting us into a relationship that we really don't have a right to be in. You see, that's really why I brought the story out in the beginning about Randy. Here's a multi-millionaire that owns more land than I could travel across in a couple of days. And I'm not trying to be humble or modest, but I do not deserve a relationship with him. Yet he invited me into it. And I think about God the same way. God, you're holy, you're perfect, there's no flaw in you, God. And yet you've invited me into this relationship with you through Christ. I don't deserve that. I really don't have a place there, God. And Jesus is showing us through the story of this woman, oh yeah, you do. Yes, you do. Because I'm inviting you into this. And that's what he wants us to see with grace. Well, John makes it very clear that this woman had sinned. I mean, how could you read this and not see, hey, she committed a sin? And so John points that out pretty clearly. But he also points out that Jesus gave her an invitation to go and sin no more. He invited her in to connect with him. The religious guys here in the story, you know what? They were all about organized religion. They were. Jesus was all about personal relationship. That's a huge difference. And so that's one of the things I think we can capture from this story is that it's not about organized religion. It's about Jesus inviting us into authentic relationship through grace. A gift that we don't deserve. Now, guys, I want all of us today. This is not a message just to you. It's a message to me, too. I want all of us to think about this, okay? You see, grace, in the aspect of grace, do we own our junk or does our junk own us when we talk about grace? You see, what I've realized in my own life is this. In order for me to move forward in my life, in order for me to move forward or take steps in God's direction, I've got to deal with my stuff from back here. I have to. And when John points out this woman's situation in that we looked at a moment ago, he's just simply pointing out a woman that had to deal with her junk, okay? She had to get the junk in her life out of her life. And I realized if I want to move forward spiritually in my life, no matter what level I'm on, here, up, whatever it is, if I want to move forward, then I really need to deal with some stuff that's behind me. I do. And guys, listen, I have to do that all the time. As a human being, I have to deal with the stuff that's behind me all the time. And quite honestly, so do you. Everyone does. And so when we look at this, I know this may seem foreign to some of us, but we see from early on, guys, that it's really difficult, and we're taught this almost, to admit failure. We're afraid to make ourselves vulnerable. And the reason we do is because we think that, if we make ourselves vulnerable or we talk about failures, then that makes us look weak. And so what happens? We cover them up. We avoid them. And so, to keep me from getting, hurt or whatever, I avoid my problems. I cover them up. I don't want to admit that I have failures because that makes me look weak. It makes me look, something. And when John draws us into the story of this promiscuous woman, he's showing us somebody. Remember when he said that she had to stand in front of the whole group? Remember that part? I mean, think about how vulnerable she was. And Jesus is showing us in that story that, hey, man, here's a woman standing there and everybody sees what she did. Everybody knows what she's done. And she is like laid open, busted. And he's saying in order for us to move forward spiritually, and there's no better time to do that than Easter resurrection, we got to deal with our stuff. And then we got to ask ourselves, does our junk own us or do we own our junk? And sometimes what happens is we don't own our junk. We don't. We hide it. We avoid it. We repress it. We try to get away from it. And all these things which create these shallow relationships that I talked about a moment ago. Some of you may know people who've grown up in families, and the most important thing was talked about was this. Don't mention that. Don't talk about that. And we develop this sort of, this discipline of denial, so to speak. And then we deny all these things in our lives. If something's wrong, we just kind of pretend it's not there. We don't acknowledge it. We cover it up. We repress it. We avoid it. All that stuff. But you know what? No matter how often or how much we do that, guess what? Guess what the truth is? It's still there. No matter how much we repress it, it's still there. How much we avoid it, it's still there. How much we deny it, our junk is still there. And so then we get to this place where it's either I own my junk or my junk owns me. And I can tell you there are millions of people walking around every day and their junk owns them. Their junk owns them. And Jesus wasn't, John doesn't bring this story out so that we can see this woman's sin. One of the reasons John brings this story out is so that we can see that this woman owns her junk. Because when we own our junk, then our life is allowed to move forward. You see, instead of repressing the stuff that's in our lives, guys, I want to encourage all of us with this today. As we approach Resurrection Sunday, as you've come to church this morning, maybe God's going to do something in your life. You don't even know what He's doing. And instead of repressing this stuff and avoiding it and trying to get out of it and skip town with it, can I ask you to consider something today? Can I ask you to consider owning your junk so that you can move forward spiritually, so that you can move forward in your life, in your relationships? You see, grace meets us in the dirt. It does. Right there in the dirt, that's where grace meets us. And when we stop repressing the things that we're trying to hide, guess what grace does? Grace empowers us to move forward when we own it. Because it really is true. Either we own our junk or our junk owns us, one of the two. We all have pasts. We all have mistakes. We all have things we wish we'd have done. Things we wish we hadn't done. Every one of us, guys. And the reality of it is this. Those things shape our lives, whether we like it or not. And if we're going to move forward, then it's like, hey, I want to embrace this. I want to man up today. Or I want to woman up. Okay? And I want to own my junk. And I want to bring that junk to the cross of Calvary. I want to nail my junk to the cross. Jesus nailed Himself to the cross. And I want to nail my junk to the cross. And the reason I do is because I just want to open myself up to God, whatever God has for me. And I want God to come into my life through the power of Jesus Christ. And I want a fresh start. I want to move forward in my life with Him at this Resurrection Sunday. And I want to just simply lay my junk at the feet of the cross. Why? Because He's giving me an invitation to this authentic relationship. Now, guys, I want you to watch this real quick.
There's a thing, they also call you, and I'm going to say, I don't want to look at you when I say this, but they call you the arm collector. Because you almost snap people's arms in half when you're fighting them.
Not always, almost.
Almost. But I mean, almost, if they don't say the right word, their arm's getting broken.
Well, so, if they say anything, that's called a verbal submission, so you can have any safety word you want.
Yeah, so, but could you show me just safely what the arm... Because you do like what is it called, the arm bar?
Yeah, well, in judo it's called jujikatame.
Of course.
And give me your arm, I'll show you.
No, that's obvious, yeah. Well, in America, that's right. I knew that.
Yeah, my mom taught it to me.
Your mom taught you, so it's the, yeah. Oh yeah, jujikatame.
So you have to give me your arm.
I'll give you, I will, but I need a safe word, so we all, this is, a lot of people are my witnesses here, yeah. If I say pineapple or Rumpelstiltskin.
We gotta pick one. I'm gonna get confused if you don't commit.
The Rumpelstiltskin.
Okay, you got it. Okay, ready?
No. All right, wait. You're going a little bit too fast. Take your time and just show me the idea of what happens. Okay. So we're fighting each other.
So you have the person's arm. And your arm doesn't go beyond 180 degrees, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't take a lot of pressure. You just push it right at the elbow joint.
Rumpy, yeah.
Rumpy what?
What? Wait, but what's this?
Rumpy what?
Yeah. All right, Rumpelstiltskin. All right, good. Rumpelstiltskin. Oh, I see that right there. Wow. That was scary. That's like putting your head in the lion's mouth right there. Wow, that was intense for me. We love you, pal, and best of luck. We're rooting for you. Ronda Rousey right there. My fight, your fight. Available May 12th.
Okay, if you're not familiar with UFC, that's Ronda Rousey, and she's a pretty tough girl. And the point of the reason I wanted to show that to you is because this, guys, listen, I think that's a great picture of how we sometimes look at our relationship with God. It's like if we come to God, then God's got us by the arm, and He's he's strong. We're twisting and we're trying to get out of it. And he's pressuring us to surrender, to give up, to give in. And it's like, and so we back off from that. It's like, it's like someone just like grinding you into this relationship. And it's not that at all. It's God coming to us with a loving heart and inviting us into a relationship, not pressuring us into one, not fighting us into one, not forcing us into one, but trying to invite us into one. An authentic relationship with Him, not twisting our arms, not submitting to authority, so to speak. And we're afraid to come sometimes because we think we'll get hurt. And God's saying, this is a safe place to be. This is a safe place for you. And my grace extends an invitation for you to come. To come. Well, let's pray. Father, thank you. What a joy it is to know an authentic relationship with you. I don't fully grasp that sometimes, God, because you're so much bigger than I am. But I know this. I know I've experienced it for many years now, and so have many people here today. And so I ask you this morning, God, to help us. Lord, just help us during this season, this time, to come clean with you. To just lay it down on the altar with you, Lord. All this stuff. And allow you to invite us into this place of grace that just gives us this wonderful opportunity of moving forward, of new life. Lord, there may be some people here this morning that they're processing all this. They're thinking about Christianity, or they're trying to understand it, or maybe they feel something in their heart and they don't quite understand it. Lord, help them. God, help them today to take at least one more step in your direction. And we want to help them with that, God, if we need to. And so during this time of commitment, Lord, let us all just put our hearts on the cross with you. And Lord Jesus, wipe our junk out. Help us to ask you to forgive us of those things so that we can move forward. We can move on in newness, in resurrected life with Christ. And we pray in His